At exactly 6 a.m., I stood in what was once my sacred parking space, now a soggy, muddy crater with a garden hose still gurgling and a half-buried yellow traffic cone bobbing like a weary soldier after a battle. Shirtless and drenched to the bone, I gripped a rusted shovel in one hand and my lukewarm coffee in the other, while HOA Officer Dan gaped at the chaos, his walkie-talkie spitting static. "What the hell happened here?" he stammered. I took a deliberate sip, met his eyes, and deadpanned. "Karen happened, so I turned it into a pond." That was the instant everything shifted from a parking spat to a full-blown personal vendetta. It all kicked off a week earlier with a pint-sized yellow Miata and a truckload of entitlement. Karen rolled into the neighborhood 5 months ago, and from day one it felt like tuning into a live reality show. She strutted in oversized sunglasses. At dusk, paraded a teacup poodle in a tutu, and zipped around in a glitter-decaled golf cart like she owned the place. The first time she parked in my spot, I brushed it off. Everyone slips up. The second time, I left a polite, sticky note. The third, I reported it to the HOA. But by the fifth time, it hit me. Karen wasn't confused. She just didn't give a darn. That spot wasn't just any parking space. It was the one closest to our door, designated years ago as a reasonable accommodation for my wife, who's been battling mobility issues since a brutal accident. There's even a little metal sign that reads "Assigned Reserved." Karen, though, saw it as an open invitation. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you have any confrontation with the HOA. We will narrate your story on our channel. Like it every time. I approached her, she'd wave dismissively and say, "It's only for a second," which often turned into half a day, and each time I reported it, the HOA responded with robotic indifference. "We'll investigate the matter that investigation apparently involved," ignoring the photo evidence I sent, and somehow concluding that perhaps I had digitally altered the timestamp. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. My wife had a specialist appointment across town. A rare opening we'd waited months for. We walked outside with her walker and bag in hand, only to find Karen's Miata parked square in our space again. I knocked on her door for 10 full minutes before she finally opened it. Mid-con conversation on her phone, without breaking her call, she smirked, said "oops," and shut the door. No apology, no move, we had to cancel the appointment. My wife tried to stay calm, but I saw the hurt in her eyes that night. Something inside me clicked. No more warnings, no more notes. Karen had declared war on decency, and I was done. Being nice the next morning, I politely asked her to stop once again. She replied with a smirk and said, "You can't own a piece of asphalt, sweetheart, don't be so dramatic." That same afternoon, I found a scratch across my rear bumper that hadn't been there before. It was deep, purposeful, and unmistakably fresh. I reviewed the footage from my driveway camera at 2:47 p.m. Karen brushed against my car with her purse, looked at the camera, grinned, then casually swiped her key across the paint. I nearly laughed out loud. The arrogance was cartoonish at this point. Instead of confronting her again, I visited my old friend Lewis, who happened to work in city zoning over beer. "And chips," I explained the situation and floated a wild idea. What if I turned the parking spot into part of my landscaping? Technically, the land was on my property line. Lewis chuckled, then frowned thoughtfully and said, "Actually, you might be able to get away with it." He pulled out his laptop, checked some boundary lines, and by the end of that night we had a working plan. All I needed was to call it stormwater management landscaping, and I could legally apply for a minor excavation permit the next morning. I filed the application by Friday. I had approval that weekend the real fun began. I started small, using my backyard tools to dig around the edges of the space while Karen watched from her porch, arms crossed and judgment dialed to 11, I marked the spot with utility flags, knowing full well that would only confuse and irritate her. A few neighbours walked by and asked if I was adding a flower bed. I nodded and said, something like that. On Sunday afternoon, I rented a mini excavator. The HOA rules allowed for landscaping tools to be temporarily parked on property, another beautiful loophole. By Monday morning, my parking spot was a shallow basin roughly the size of a small above-ground pool. Karen was livid. She marched across the yard, red-faced arms swinging like she was conducting a furious orchestra. "You can't just dig up the parking lot," she barked. I calmly handed her a copy of the city-approved permit. She snatched. It squinted and looked like a toddler staring at long division. "This is outrageous. I'll call the HOA," I smiled. "Please do, and tell them to bring a tape measure that night." I installed a simple garden hose irrigation system that fed slowly into the depression, just a trickle to start with. Then I added a few water plants for effect. Karen stormed out of her house and yelled across the yard, "You're flooding the neighborhood." The irony was delicious considering she'd flooded my life with stress for weeks, and it wasn't long before nature added its touch. Birds landed, bugs buzzed, and by midweek a pair of ducks decided to check it out. Karen's frustration reached new levels on Thursday morning. I caught her standing at the edge of the new pond, taking pictures and muttering about calling the EPA that afternoon. A notice appeared on my door from the HOA: stop unauthorized construction. Immediately, but this time, I was ready. I called Dan, the HOA officer, and invited him over when he arrived and saw the permit. He scratched his head, muttered, "Well, I'll be damned," and walked off, looking like a man who just realized he was in over his head. The final push came the next day. Karen parked in front of my driveway, since her usual illegal spot was now a foot underwater. She blocked me in and then left for the day. I snapped pictures, sent them to the HOA, and called the city parking authority when she returned. Her Miata had a bright orange tow sticker on the window and a note warning of future impound. The look on her face when she saw the ducks waddling through what used to be her favorite shortcut was priceless. I half expected her to scream, but she just stood there shaking, defeated for the first time since she moved in. Karen had nothing to say, but I wasn't done, not yet, because I knew Karen. She'd strike back, and when she did, she'd go too far. I just needed to be ready, and the pond, the ducks, the permits, and the camera system were all just pieces on the board. The real game hadn't even started the morning after Karen found the tow sticker. On her Miata, the neighborhood felt unusually quiet. It was that eerie calm that comes just before a full-blown suburban thunderstorm. I had a feeling in my gut that Karen wasn't just going to sulk about this. She was scheming, calculating in her pink sun hat with that purse of doom she used like a weapon of passive aggression. I had underestimated how deeply she'd take offense to a puddle being where she believed her royal chariot deserved to rest, but I had not underestimated my own commitment to chaos. I knew that once I started turning that space into a pond, there was no going back. I just hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly or so hilariously. I came home from work to find my hose cut clean in half, my water timer ripped out of the soil, and a trail of poodle paw prints leading straight from the soggy mess to Karen's port. Her dog wore a bow that matched her patio cushions, which also happened to be new and suspiciously placed in a direct line of sight with the pond. She was watching, always watching. I didn't even bother confronting her that time. Instead, I quietly replaced the hose and planted a row of citronella plants on the edges, partially for aesthetics, partially because I knew she hated the smell. She sneezed every time she passed them a petty victory. But I took it. The real genius, though, came when I looped in my old buddy Tyler, who ran a small drone photography business. I asked him to help document the project for my gardening blog, which didn't exist, but Tyler didn't care. He was just excited to fly over a suburban war zone that weekend. We captured some incredible aerial footage of the pond, now rimmed with riverstones and subtly landscaped to look like an intentional water feature. I even added a solar P-powered waterfall pump I found on clearance, which gave it a gentle, bubbling sound that made it seem expensive. The ducks returned, then a frog, then two more. Nature was doing its thing, and I just sat back, grinning like a man who had turned spite into serenity. But of course, Karen wasn't just going to let that be the end of it. Monday morning, I saw her on the phone in her driveway, gesturing wildly toward the pond while pacing in angry little circles. She stopped when she noticed my drone hovering overhead and gave it the finger. The footage was golden. I posted it anonymously to the neighborhood social group with the caption, "Karen loses an argument to a duck pond." Within an hour, it had 32 likes, and someone added a slow-motion effect to her hand gesture. I knew I had gone viral in our little cul-de-sac microcosm, and the best part was she didn't even know it was me. Tuesday, a city inspector showed up. He had a clipboard, a badge, and the exhausted expression of someone who'd been dragged into HOA drama far too many times. Karen followed him like a shadow as he examined the pond, took notes, and then walked over to me with a sigh. He asked for the permit, which I handed over with a smile. He reviewed. It made a note, then leaned in slightly and whispered, "I'm just here because someone filed 5 separate complaints, under 5 different names, all from the same IP address." He gave me a knowing look and walked away. Karen didn't even try to hide her disappointment as she trailed behind him, probably explaining how the ducks were out to get her, or how I was orchestrating a domestic water crisis that evening. The HOA called an emergency meeting. I had expected it for days. They always held these things in the community center, where cheap folding chairs and burnt coffee somehow made neighborhood disputes feel more official. Karen arrived in full litigation mode, carrying a stack of binders, pictures, and what looked like hand-drawn diagrams of duck-related damage. I came in with a USB drive, a folder of my permits, and a cup of tea. The meeting kicked off with HOA President Mark clearing his throat like he was about to announce a new law, and then immediately yielding the floor to Karen, who stood like she was addressing the Supreme Court. She talked for nearly 15 minutes straight. She cited noise, pollution, mosquito breeding grounds, bird attacks, and one particularly deranged accusation that I had invited the ducks on purpose. She called the pond a biological hazard and demanded immediate action. Then she whipped out a photograph of her poodle, looking confused near the edge of the water, claiming emotional trauma. I nearly choked on my tea. When it was my turn, I simply handed over the drone footage, permit documentation, and played a clip of her keying my bumper and flipping off the drone. The room went dead silent. Then someone in the back coughed to hide a laugh. Just as Mark started to speak again, the door opened and in walked someone unexpected. Todd, the mayor's assistant, turns out. Todd lived a few doors down and had been following the entire saga with quiet amusement. He stood and said, "As a city representative, I've reviewed the permits and walked the site. Everything's in compliance also. It's a damn fine-looking pond." The room burst into murmurs. Karen looked like she'd just swallowed a lemon whole. The meeting concluded with a decision to take no action. The pond would stay. Karen stormed out her heels, clicking furiously against the tile. And I lingered behind, just long enough to hear someone say, "Honestly, the ducks are kind of cute." That night I celebrated with a pizza and watched from my living room as Karen dragged a traffic cone to block the road in front of her house like a self-appointed general staging a last stand. I couldn't help but laugh. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the moment my little duck pond had triumphed. The ducks floated lazily beneath the moonlight while I sat on the porch with my tea, wondering just how far Karen would go next and how much more ridiculous this could all get. Something told me the answer was very, very far. By the time Thursday rolled around, I thought maybe Karen had run out of steam. Her last few attempts had ended in spectacular failure. The HOA had taken my side, and the ducks were now minor celebrities in the neighborhood. I had even received an anonymous thank you card with duck stickers on it that simply said, "Thanks for the entertainment, go pond guy." But peace is never permanent when you live next to a Karen, and I should have known her silence wasn't surrender, it was preparation, because that morning she struck back in a way that was so absurd, so outlandishly desperate that it would have been funny if it hadn't been so incredibly messy. It started with a strange gurgling sound coming from the hose line I'd installed to keep the pond fed. I walked out, half awake, with coffee in hand, and noticed something bubbling in the water. Not the usual aerator bubbling, but something thick and unnatural. Then the smell hit me. Chlorine. Not the light poolside scent of summer, but the aggressive stench of industrial-grade cleaner. I shut off the system immediately and followed the hose line, back behind the hedges where I found a puncture wound in the rubber tubing. Next to it was an empty container of pool shock tossed lazily into the bushes. It didn't take a detective to figure out who had done it. My first reaction was disbelief. Dumping chemicals into a man-made pond in the middle of a suburban neighborhood with ducks and frogs and other wildlife clearly visible that wasn't petty anymore, it was illegal. I immediately grabbed my phone and checked the footage from my wildlife cam, and there she was, Karen, dressed in all white, like she was attending a bizarre ritual, sneaking up to the hose and pouring something into a funnel with her face twisted in triumph. I saved the video, made several backup copies, and sent one straight to the city's environmental compliance officer. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the duck floating with its head tucked in, wondering if this war had just turned into a criminal case. But the twists didn't stop there that afternoon. An HOA meeting notice was posted to everyone's door again. This time it wasn't about the pond, it was about the water. The message warned of potential contamination due to an unauthorized landscaping project. My name wasn't mentioned, but the intent was obvious. I knew Karen was behind it. The language had her melodramatic flair, and the fact that the HOA was still pretending to be neutral made it even more irritating. I called Mark, the HOA president, and asked point blank if Karen had supplied any new complaint. He sighed and said, "She submitted a 14-page document accusing you of creating an ecological collapse." 14 pages. I couldn't even write that much in college. While I prepared my response, something even more insane happened that evening. I walked out to check on the pond and noticed something strange stuck in the mud near the edge. It was a small metal plaque, clearly handmade, with the words, "Private property violators will be prosecuted," etched into it with what looked like a wood-burning tool. I blinked twice, then looked over toward Karen's yard. Her patio umbrella was tilted toward my pond, like a satellite dish spying on a foreign enemy. It was then I realized she was trying to claim the pond as her own. Whether to manipulate the hoy or twist legal boundaries, I couldn't say, but the audacity made my jaw drop. I removed the plaque, placed it on her porch without a word, and then installed 2 new security cameras, one facing the hose line and one pointed at the pond itself. That night, I also contacted a local wildlife rehabilitator who offered to inspect the water and check the ducks for signs of chemical exposure to her credit. The lady arrived promptly and treated the situation with more professionalism than I expected. After testing, she confirmed that the chemical level was low enough not to harm the ducks long term, but high enough to trigger an official violation if reported. I handed her a flash drive with the video and she nodded solemnly. "This is more common than you'd think," she said. "Some people just hate being outsmarted." By Friday morning, a new twist emerged. Karen's golf cart, which she used like a royal chariot to parade around the neighborhood, was missing from her driveway. I didn't think much of it until I heard shouting from across the street. Karen was arguing, with a tow truck driver screaming something about unjustified removal and municipal theft. I couldn't resist watching. Apparently someone had called in a tip that her golf cart was parked illegally on city-maintained sidewalk space the city took. It seriously, and the cart was towed. Karen was losing it. She pointed toward my house multiple times during her tantrum, but the driver just shrugged. I had nothing to do with it this time, though I wish I had some other neighbor had taken initiative. The war had officially gone community-wide. Later that afternoon, I got a knock on my door from none other than Dan, the exhausted HOA officer. He held a manila folder and looked like he wanted to be anywhere else we need to talk. He said he stepped inside and opened the folder, revealing a printout of Karen's 14-page complaint. I skimmed it. Accusations ranged from wildlife trafficking to mosquito weaponization. Dan sighed and said, "We're obligated to follow up, but between you and me, this is nuts." I handed him the wildlife report, the footage of Karen dumping chemicals, and the original zoning documents. He didn't say a word for a long time. Then he chuckled and said, "You know what's wild? She accused you of digging a moat like with medieval intent." As Dan left, I caught a glimpse of Karen standing on her porch again, arms crossed, poodle under one arm, like a furry weapon of guilt. We locked eyes. She narrowed hers. I smiled. I had survived her latest round, but the battle was far from over that evening. The ducks returned to the pond in full force, quacking, splashing, and somehow looking more smug than usual. One even climbed onto the solar pump and sat there like a sentry. My wife joined me on the porch and asked, "Do you think she'll give up?" I shook my head. "Not a chance, but I've got plans." Because I had just submitted a request to the city for a community beautification grant, one that included a proposal to turn the pond into a fully landscaped rain garden with native plants and a walking path. If it went through, it would become protected municipal green space and Karen would never be allowed near it again. As I sipped my tea, I realized something. This had started as an act of frustration, a silly plan born from exhaustion and irritation, but now it was a mission, not just to defend my parking space, but to turn this entire thing into a legacy of well-planned, legally airtight pettiness. Karen wanted a war. I was going to give her an empire with ducks, frogs, and a permit to prove it by the time the frogs showed up. Knew the pond had reached a tipping point. What started as a passive-aggressive landscaping maneuver had become a full-blown ecosystem, complete with buzzing dragonflies, chirping crickets, and a chorus of frogs that began their nightly concert around "Sit and drink sharp." The neighborhood kids loved it. Elderly walkers slowed down to smile at the duck. Even a local high school student asked if he could take photos for his biology project. But while the pond's popularity among humans and animals grew, Karen's fury bloomed like algae in sunlight. She no longer spoke. She scowled. Every single time she walked by, her little poodle barked furiously as if the pond had insulted its ancestors, and then she snapped. I had just finished planting native wetland flowers along the far edge of the pond when I heard a scream. Not a panicked scream or one of pain, but one of pure frustration. I turned to see Karen stumbling backward, soaking wet, her designer shoes flinging mud with every step. Apparently she had tried to plant one of her little fake "Hoi" warning signs right near the edge and had slipped straight into the water. My wildlife camera caught it all in glorious HD. Her poodle had stood at the edge, barking frantically while she crawled out, covered in pond muck and wet cattail fronds, like a suburban monster. Rising from a swamp, she looked around, saw the camera, and then hurled her ruined handbag at it, missed by a foot. It was beautiful. She didn't come out for 2 days after that. I heard rumors she was drafting complaints, calling lawyers, and even contacting a local journalist, but all that scheming didn't prepare her for the real shocker. A few days later, a city zoning official arrived to inspect the property. This time it wasn't to shut anything down, quite the opposite. My grant application for community beautification had been approved, and the official was there to take measurements for the preliminary review. Once they confirmed the pond's location was viable, I could move forward with having it officially designated as protected stormwater. Landscaping the paperwork would take time, but from that moment forward, any interference with it, chemical or physical, could result in real legal penalties. I didn't even have to tell Karen, she already knew. I assume she read every bulletin the city issued, now desperately looking for anything. With my name on it that afternoon, she re-emerged in full battle dress, wide-brimmed hat, white gloves, a clipboard tucked under one arm, and her mouth drawn tight like she'd bitten into a lemon. She strutted toward the pond with a tape measure in hand, muttering loudly enough for me to hear things like illegal expansion and ridiculous duck shrine. I just waved and went back to adjusting the solar light I'd placed near the edge of the water. The light flicked on automatically at dusk, casting a soft, golden glow across the ripples and making the frogs and ducks look like wildlife influencers posing for a nature magazine. I could almost feel Karen's rage vibrating through the air. Then came the meeting that broke everything wide open. Another HOA gathering, this one scheduled at Karen's request. The agenda item discussion of the pond's escalating threat to community harmony. She claimed it was attracting mosquitoes, lowering property values, and interfering with pedestrian flow, whatever that meant. The room was full when I arrived, but this time something was different. People weren't nodding along with her anymore. They were whispering, chuckling, shaking their heads. Karen, oblivious, launched into a 30-slide PowerPoint presentation. She used red arrows and blurry screenshots from the drone footage, most of which backfired hilariously. One showed her holding a can of pool shock near my hose. Another showed her midst arms flailing as she fell into the water by the 10th slide. Even Mark, the HOA president, looked like he regretted his life choices when she finished. There was silence, then one voice. Todd, the mayor's assistant, cleared his throat. Actually, I'd like to speak in support of the pond. Karen turned as if she'd been slapped. Todd stood looking calm and unbothered. I live a few doors down. My kids love it. It's legal, it's beautiful, and let's be honest, it's the only interesting thing this HOA has seen in 5 years. Someone laughed. Then another. Even Mark cracked a smile. Karen tried to object, but her voice wavered. It's not about ducks, she insisted. It's about order." But her order was crumbling. The meeting ended with no action taken again, and this time a motion was raised to reconsider the HOA's bylaws on natural landscaping, suggesting more flexibility and less micromanagement. Karen left in a huff, and for a moment I thought that might be the end of it, but of course it wasn't. Her final act of desperation came a few days later, and it was the most absurd. Yet I had installed a bench near the pond, just a little wooden thing with a plaque that read, "Reserved for pond watchers." I thought it was funny, so did the neighbors, but apparently Karen saw it as a declaration of war, because the next morning I found her crouched by the bench, attempting to paint over the plaque with a bottle of nail polish. She didn't hear me approach. I stood there for a moment, watching this grown woman angrily dabbing bright pink polish on a piece of wood, like it had personally insulted her. When she finally noticed me, she froze, then stood up quickly, hiding the bottle behind her back. "Just fixing the vandalism," she stammered. I said nothing. I didn't have to. She backed away slowly, then turned and walked off with her head-high polish stains on her gloves, dignity somewhere at the bottom of the pond. That same evening, something incredible happened. A pair of ducks began performing what could only be described as a mating dance right on the stone edge of the pond. They flapped and strutted and squawked, drawing a small audience of amused neighbors. One woman brought out snacks. A kid set up a folding chair. Someone even streamed it, live on their phone with the title, "Duck Wedding Pre-Game Karen." Watching from behind her blinds looked like she might explode, and when one of the ducks climbed onto the very bench she had defaced, quacked loudly, and then did its business directly on the smeared pink paint, I nearly cried. Laughing word spread fast within hours. The video of the duck wedding bench incident had gone semi-viral on the local subreddit. A few neighbors started calling the area Karen's Pond sarcastically, and someone made a little wooden sign with those exact words and stuck it next to the bench. It was harmless, funny, and legally unassailable, but for Karen, it was the final insult that night. She came out and tried to rip the sign out of the ground, only to trip over the irrigation tubing and land face first in the mud. Again, my camera caught it all, and this time someone nearby caught it in person and applauded. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just sat there for a minute, soaked, stunned, defeated. Then she stood, limped away, and left the sign exactly where it was, and just like that the battle shifted. The neighbors had chosen a side, and it wasn't hers. I didn't gloat, I didn't retaliate. I just kept tending the pond, planting new flowers, adjusting the lights, making it better, because by then it wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was a symbol, a little patch of peace, carved out through chaos, nurtured by spite and defended by ducks. And Karen, she had turned herself into a cautionary tale, the antagonist in a story she could no longer control. But I had one final move left, and I was saving it for just the right moment, because if she thought she was done with the pond, she hadn't seen anything yet. The final chapter of the war between me and Karen began with a lawsuit, a real official stamped by a court clerk. Lawsuit that arrived in a beige envelope, hand-delivered by a man who looked so tired he could have been mistaken for one of the frogs at my pond. I accepted the envelope without a word and opened it. At my kitchen table, while sipping tea inside, was a stack of papers where Karen accused me of everything from deliberate property devaluation to duck-induced mental anguish. She claimed my pond was a nuisance, a threat to the health and safety of the neighborhood, and for good measure, a tool of harassment. I blinked, then I laughed so hard I spilled my tea. She'd actually tried to sue me for having ducked. Of course, lawsuits have a way of backfiring when you don't have your facts straight. Her complaint included a list of demands that read more like a tantrum than legal filing removal of the pond prohibition from speaking about her in public forums, financial restitution for emotional trauma, and a mandatory apology delivered via a community newsletter. Unfortunately for her, the documents had one fatal flaw. She also listed the HOA as a co-defendant, alleging they failed to stop me. That meant she dragged them into the mess too. And they were not happy. Within a week, the HOA's legal counsel filed a motion to dismiss and counter-sued Karen for defamation harassment and repeated violations of community peace standard. Suddenly Karen found herself being buried under the weight of her own nonsense. The next few weeks were blissfully peaceful for me anyway. Karen was rarely seen outside, and when she was, it was only to hurriedly retrieve her mail or shuffle her poodle through a 5-second walk. Meanwhile, I was busy finishing the last touches on the pond project. I added stepping stones around the edge, planted some low reeds and flowering water plants, and installed a discreet wooden sign that read, Certified Community Bio Retention Zone. City approved. It was more than just a jab. It was a shield. The pond had become officially classified as a functional stormwater catchment, which meant it was now protected by municipal environmental policy. Karen could scream all she wanted, but legally speaking, the pond was as permanent as the sidewalk. It didn't take long for word to spread. Local blogs picked up the duck pond drama, framing it as a wholesome example of nature triumphing over pettiness. One article called me the Pond Avenger, which made me cringe and laugh in equal parts. Another did a full photo spread of the ducks and the nightlight pond with the caption, When neighbors attack, let the ducks fight back. I wasn't trying to be famous, I was just trying to keep my parking spot, but I had somehow become the face of Hoy rebellion, and I didn't hate it. And then came the real cherry on top. A real estate agent contacted me asking if I'd be open to selling my property at a significantly inflated price. Apparently, buyers were interested not just in the house, but in the now famous duck pond and the community support it had rallied. I declined, of course, but it felt like poetic justice. My property value had gone up while Karen was stuck living next to a piece of public mockery she had helped create. She wanted me gone. Instead, I was thriving, and that must have eaten at her. But Karen wasn't done, not yet. Her last desperate move came one rainy morning. I woke up to the sound of metal scraping pavement. I looked out the window and saw Karen, dressed in a raincoat and boots, pushing a wheelbarrow full of sandbags toward the pond. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. She began stacking them at the low end of the basin as if trying to divert the rainwater away from the pond and toward the street. I watched, stunned, then amused, then finally annoyed. I walked out with my phone and calmly said, "You know this is a crime, right?" She froze, turned slowly and shouted, "This is my right as a homeowner. This pond is a threat to everyone. You've poisoned this neighborhood." By the time the police arrived, thanks to another neighbor who had already called, they found her knee-deep in pond muck, shrieking about conspiracy and hoe corruption, while throwing sandbags like she was defending a medieval castle. The responding officer recognized her immediately. He took one look at the footage from my camera, one look at the city zoning paperwork I had laminated in a folder, and calmly told her to leave the pond alone or face arrest for tampering with city-designated infrastructure. She tried to argue, but she was so loud and belligerent that they ended up escorting her back to her house for everyone's peace of mind. The image of her slipping in the mud one last time as she was led away was the closing scene of a saga I hadn't known I was starring in. A week later, She put her house up for sale. The listing made no mention of the duck pond, but word had gotten around. Curious buyers came by to see the house, but ended up hanging out by the water chatting with neighbors and feeding the duck. Karen moved out 2 months later in the dead of night, like a villain slinking off after a failed heist. Her moving van got stuck, turning around by the pond, and one of the ducks waddled over and sat directly in her path. I watched from the porch, sipping tea, not moving to help. She was finally leaving, and I wasn't going to miss a second of it. After she was gone, things only got better. The new family who bought her house was friendly, quiet, and completely enchanted by the pond. The husband even helped me clean up the sign and repainted the bent. His daughter named one of the ducks Sir Quaxo, and the name stuck. The HOA, now free of Karen's weekly complaints and paranoid accusations, relaxed. Mark even stopped by one day and said, "You know, I think this might be the best thing that's ever happened to the neighborhood." I just nodded, watching the ducks glide across the water as the sun set behind them. There were no more lawsuits, no more screaming matches, no more chlorine dumped under cover of darkness. The pond had won. I had won not because I argued Karen, but because I had used her aggression against her at every step, turned her noise into momentum, and made her the villain of her own story. I didn't have to be cruel or underhanded. I just had to be patient and smarter than her. And let's be honest, between the ducks, the drone footage, and the mud-soaked downfall, I had the best supporting cast a petty homeowner could ask for. Looking back now, I still can't believe it started over a parking spot, one little space on asphalt that could have easily been resolved with a bit of courtesy. But because Karen had to push, had to dominate, had to win every imaginary battle, she created a war that buried her in the very dirt she tried to own. And me, I have a pond, I have peace, and I have the best view on the block ducks included.